The Napoleonic Wars reshaped and changed history and the map of Europe unlike any other conflict before it, and were only matched by both world wars that followed a century later. Upon assuming command of French forces, Napoleon extended his reach across Europe into Egypt and the Middle East. But Napoleon's fortunes rose and fell, with victories and defeats, some being more important than others, and one naval battle, while critical to limiting his expansionist program, and not considered by him to be that significant, was actually setting the stage for his future problems. What was the Battle of the Nile? Who was involved? How did it affect both parties? What was the end result? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. The French Republic and its Grand Army had managed to take hold of Western Europe. The British were unable to intervene on the continent at that time. Napoleon had plans to invade Central and Eastern Europe, but he realized his forces were not yet ready for that undertaking, so he looked elsewhere. The expedition to Egypt and Syria from 1798 to 1801 was part of Bonaparte's desire to remove Ottoman influence from that region and have a gateway to British-held India, as well as establish a French colony hoping to dominate the Mediterranean Sea. With 38,000 soldiers, he had a sizable force. The French had some early successes, but due to a multitude of problems, the campaign faltered. But there were some historical successes, such as the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and the birth of modern Egyptology. Napoleon relied upon the French Navy to transport his troops and resupply his forces. They would also be critical in bringing more troops in and taking his soldiers home when that campaign was over. In early May 1798, French Vice Admiral François-Paul Brice d'Aiguillard, a 45-year-old naval officer from a minor aristocratic background, organized a fleet of 13 ships of the line, 13 frigates, and over 200 cargo vessels in Toulon to transport the new Armée d'Orient to Egypt. To maintain the element of surprise, Bonaparte went to great lengths to conceal the fleet's destination, even from his own men. D'Aiguillard and a handful of his officers knew of the expedition's purpose. British spies knew the fleet set sail on May 19th. When word reached London, the cabinet of Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger was left guessing as to its destination. The War Secretary, Henry Dundas, believed that Egypt was the destination, but that idea was dismissed by his colleagues, who told him to think with a map in your hand and with a calculation of distances. Vice Admiral Baron John Jervis of Mayford and St. Vincent, commander of the Mediterranean Fleet, wanted to find out what the French were up to. St. Vincent dispatched 3 warships commanded by Rear Admiral Horatio Nelson, who was recently stationed off Gibraltar. Adding 10 more ships, they began their search of the Mediterranean Sea, first sailing to the Italian coast. Nelson had no idea where the French fleet was going, but if they were to head out into the Atlantic Ocean, they would be seen by Royal Navy vessels. But Nelson did not think that was their destination either. 2 days later, on May 21st, Nelson's flagship was dismasted in a storm which scattered his squadron toward Sardinia, and they set there for repairs. Nelson's small fleet again started their pursuit, managing to sail within 20 miles of the French fleet, but the ships of both fleets were hidden from each other by a thick fog and remained unseen. Nelson was not sure where they were headed at that time, so he sent his small, fast sloops to various ports to gather information, and if they spotted the French, they could outrun the larger French ships and report their location. The French fleet arrived in Malta on June 10th because Bonaparte wanted to secure the island before taking his forces onto Egypt. But Bonaparte decided to order an invasion, claiming that the island had shown hostility by not allowing his ships to anchor. Malta was governed by the Knights of St. John military order, and Malta, with its fortress, had managed to withstand attacks in the past. The main problem was that half the knights there were French, and they refused to fight other Frenchmen. Bonaparte stole the treasury, expelled the Knights of St. John, abolished slavery and feudalism, reformed the hospital and university, and allowed the Jews to build their synagogues. Bonaparte then left behind a garrison force to administer the island and sailed for Alexandria, Egypt on June 19th. Nelson came across a Genoese merchant ship and was told that the French had left Malta on June 15th and were sailing east. Nelson believed the French were sailing for Alexandria, and, assuming the French had a 6-day head start, he immediately raced toward Egypt. The French took the long route around Crete to throw off any British pursuers. Taking extra precautions, the French ordered every merchant ship they came across to be seized and detained until they reached Egypt. But Nelson believed the French had left Malta 4 days earlier than they actually had, based upon the information he received. The French were actually much closer. On the night of June 22nd and 23rd, British and French fleets again passed within miles of one another, again concealed by a thick fog. Nelson suspected that Napoleon was going to try and establish a French presence, and Alexandria was the most logical anchorage. The French presence would threaten the eastern Mediterranean, but Nelson had other ideas. Nelson arrived at Alexandria on June 28th, but the French fleet was nowhere in sight. Realizing he had lost the enemy fleet, Nelson waited 24 hours before sailing out of Alexandria, heading back north. Then, things changed. The French fleet arrived off the coast of Alexandria on July 1st, and Bonaparte's army disembarked at Maribut, about 8 miles away. French troops attacked Alexandria the next morning, and the city was in French hands by midday. After a week in Alexandria, Bonaparte moved toward Cairo on July 7th, leaving the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay with 2,000 men behind as an occupation force. Napoleon did not plan his excursion very well. Admiral Brueys delivered the troops and supplies, and some of his ships were sent back to gather more supplies. Meanwhile, Bonaparte decided to march through the desert, which was brutal on the men, exacerbated by scorching heat, mosquitoes, black flies, disease, and lack of water. The French troops found that the wells were often poisoned or blocked up by the Bedouin tribesmen. Many soldiers suffered from malaria, ophthalmia, which caused temporary blindness, and stragglers were picked off by the pursuing Mamluks. It was said that you could follow Napoleon's march from the trail of corpses that marked his route of march. Discipline plummeted as men dropped dead, with many soldiers shooting themselves, with some deserting and others plotting mutiny. But when the French reached the Nile River, things looked better, and Napoleon defeated the Mamluk army under Murad Bey at the minor Battle of Shubraqit, and later at the Battle of the Pyramids. But Napoleon needed food, powder, and ammunition. The British were sailing west of Crete with a brief pit stop at Sicily to take on supplies. Nelson turned east again, putting into port at Koroni off the Peloponnese on July 28th. This was when Nelson was informed by the local Ottoman governor of the French invasion of Egypt. This was corroborated when one of Nelson's ships captured a French brig that was on its way to Egypt carrying wine. Nelson immediately sailed for Egypt, arriving off Alexandria on the morning of August 1st. This was when things became worse for the French, after Nelson learned exactly where the French fleet was. If the Royal Navy could sink the French fleet in Aboukir Bay, where the Nile River flowed into the sea, it would isolate Napoleon and strand his forces, essentially protecting British interest where India was concerned. Napoleon's army would hopefully die on the vine due to starvation and disease, or fall prey to their new Ottoman enemies. Horatio Nelson was perhaps the greatest naval tactician during the Age of Sail. Nelson agreed to accept the orders, but he also knew that his fleet was smaller than the French. Given the new information, his attack would not take place in open sea, but close to the shore of Egypt and the dangerous shoals, making navigation dangerous. After receiving several scouting reports from fast-moving sloops confirming their presence, Nelson created his plan. He had drawn a diagram of where the enemy ships were anchored. Despite being slightly outnumbered, he felt that he had a great chance at success. He knew his crews and gunners were the best trained and experienced. Nelson also knew that if his luck held, he would have the element of surprise on his side. Plus, Nelson was always an optimist. On the night of August 1st, 1798, the British made their move. Nelson's fleet was divided into two columns, and they slipped into the area as the sun began to set, but Nelson saw what he needed to know. The French fleet certainly had impressive ships, such as the 124-gun first-rate ship of the line and their flagship, the Orient, 12 third-rate ships of the line with between 74 and 80 guns, and 4 large frigates. But the ship's crews were less than a third manned due to sailors having been sent ashore to find water and food. Nelson's fleet consisted of 14 third-rate ships of the line with 74 guns, and each prepared as nightfall approached. He saw the French third-rate Guerriere was anchored farther away from the other ships, away from the shallows and shoals, which left a gap that Nelson could exploit. Nelson also saw that the French ships anchored closer to the shore would not be able to bring their landward guns to bear, and being anchored with their sails furled, they could not maneuver even in the steady wind. Knowing all of this, Nelson did not hesitate and ordered an immediate attack. His two separate columns closed in under cover of darkness. HMS Goliath under Captain Thomas Foley led the smaller column and sailed right past the anchored Guerriere through the gap between the shoals, followed by HMS Zealous, Orion, and Audacious. As it passed by, Goliath fired a full broadside into Guerriere, and the ships that followed did the same, and the French ship was rendered useless. Nelson was personally leading the larger division and attacked the French head-on, totally surprising the enemy. 6 of Nelson's faster ships, led by Goliath in the other column, sailed in behind the French ships and attacked them from their landward side. The French were so unprepared their gun ports were not even open. The French admiral had left too much open water between the port side of his fleet and the shoals, theoretically giving Nelson enough room and draft under his hulls to slip through. The two divisions soon surrounded the larger French fleet on both sides and poured full broadsides, catching the French fleet in a crossfire. British discipline, training, and leadership proved very destructive. The battle would rage until August 3rd, as ships burned, men were wounded and killed, and boarding crews fought hand-to-hand. Nelson himself was again wounded, this time in his forehead, which was a trend for him. Admiral Brueys' legs were blown off by a cannonball. Rather than go below decks to be treated, Brueys had himself placed in a chair on deck so he could continue giving orders until another cannonball struck him in the stomach, nearly cutting him in two and killing him 15 minutes later. L'Orient's captain, Luc-Julien Casabianca, was also wounded by flying debris and was taken below, leaving his 12-year-old son, Giaconte, on deck. While larger and with far more guns, the French ships and sailors were simply unprepared for the battle. Many were not well trained, and few had real combat experience. The British gunners were so well drilled by Nelson and his officers that they could fire 3 times faster than the French gunners, which made a great difference. The British column continued to blast the French ships, many using hot shot. Cannonballs heated until they glowed red, making penetration through wood bulkheads easier, touching off flammable materials, especially gunpowder. The heaviest volume of fire was focused upon the L'Orient, which caught fire and exploded, killing most of the 1,000-man crew. Commodore Petit-Tours of the Tonnant refused to surrender despite his ship being dismasted. He had lost both legs and an arm, but was placed on a bucket of wheat, and he continued to give orders, and he ordered the colors to be nailed to the mast to prevent it from being struck. But Petit-Tours also died of his wounds, and Tonnant surrendered. Nelson successfully achieved the unrivaled dominance of the Mediterranean by the Royal Navy. When Nelson finally looked out at the floating carnage of the battle, he remarked, "Victory is not a name strong enough for such a scene." When word reached London, Nelson was elevated to the peerage and House of Lords, as he had hoped, becoming Lord Nelson of the Nile. But most importantly, Nelson trapped Napoleon and his army in Egypt and cut off their supplies, which led to Napoleon losing the Siege of Acre in 1799. Nelson's victory was complete, despite sustaining 218 dead and 677 wounded. However, the French suffered much worse, losing 5,000 killed and wounded and 3,900 sailors captured. Napoleon lost 2 ships of the line sunk and 9 ships of the line captured. But Napoleon lost even more than just ships and sailors. His soldiers lost the supply line, including food, powder, and shot that they needed, and despite their early victories, they had no hope. Following his failed battle at Acre and the Syrian campaign, French forces were worn down. Wounded and sick soldiers could not be evacuated, and reinforcements were not coming. Essentially, the French were stranded. What remained of the French army numbered around 20,000 and was abandoned for 2 years in Egypt after Bonaparte himself fled to France in August of 1799. Other defeats would follow Napoleon, especially at sea, but the Battle of the Nile set the stage for establishing Great Britain as the world's supreme naval power for the next 140 years.
Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.